It happened in Jerome, Arizona, a town that calls itself the wickedest city in the West. I should have taken that as a warning. Nestled in the Black Hills, this place was once a booming mining town, but now it's just a quiet tourist trap with crumbling buildings and too many ghost stories. I didn't believe in that sort of thing, not until Valentine's Day last year. Now, I don't just believe. I know. My name is Ethan Palmer, and I was a journalist at the Prescott Courier. Nothing big, just local stories, historical preservation, minor crime, local business profiles. I never thought I'd be covering my own nightmare. I was sent to Jerome to write a piece on the United Verde Hospital, now an abandoned ruin perched on Cleopatra Hill. People claimed it was haunted, shadows moving, whispers in empty halls, the usual nonsense. The town thrived on those rumors. Ghost tours ran every night, and every bar had a story about something unnatural in the old mining shafts beneath the streets. I didn't care. I was there for one reason, to prove there was nothing. But I wasn't alone. I had convinced Lisa, my fiancée, to come with me. She wasn't thrilled about it. Why would I want to spend Valentine's Day in a ghost town, she had complained. But after some coaxing and promising her a fancy dinner at the Haunted Hamburger, one of the local restaurants, she agreed. I wish she hadn't. We arrived in Jerome on February 13th, late in the evening. The town was quiet, empty even for a place that barely had 400 residents. The streets, usually lit with warm shop lights, were eerily dark. I remember the smell, cold mountain air mixed with something else, something metallic, like blood. But I brushed it off. We checked into the Jerome Grand Hotel, a converted hospital with a long history of death. People had died in every room, some by accident, some by suicide. It was supposed to be haunted, too, but the only horror I expected was the overpriced room. That night, Lisa had a nightmare. She thrashed in bed, muttering words I couldn't understand. Her face twisted in a grimace, and when I shook her awake, her eyes snapped open, wild, terrified. "There in the walls," she whispered. "Who?" I asked, still half asleep. She didn't answer. Just stared at the corner of the room. The next day, Valentine's Day, we made our way up to the ruins of United Verde Hospital. The old building loomed over the town like a corpse, its windows empty, its doors long since boarded up. The place was off limits, but I had convinced a local historian, Mark Redding, to give us access. Mark was waiting for us at the gate. Thin, nervous, chain-smoking. "People say this place wakes up on Valentine's Day," he said, handing me a flashlight. I laughed. Ghosts don't keep calendars. But Mark didn't smile. He just muttered, "You'll see." We stepped inside. And the first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, that presses against your chest like a weight. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in graffiti, some of it old gang tags, some of it more disturbing. "He sees. No heart. Bloody Valentine." Lisa shivered. "Let's make this quick." We moved through the halls, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. Rusted hospital beds, shattered glass, old wheelchairs left in corners like forgotten patients. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The walls looked wet. Not with water. Then we heard it. A soft scraping. Like something being dragged across the floor. Lisa grabbed my arm. "Ethan, we're not alone." I turned off the flashlight. And then, a voice. Low. Crooning. "Be mine, be mine, be mine." A shadow moved at the end of the hall. Tall. Wrong. Something wearing a hospital gown. Lisa screamed. And then the lights flickered on. And we saw what was in the room with us. The lights flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough to see what was standing at the end of the hall. It wasn't human. Not exactly. The thing wore a tattered hospital gown, yellowed with age, its fabric thin and clinging to its form like a second skin. It was tall, limbs stretched beyond natural proportions, fingers like needles. Its skin, pale, almost translucent, looked pulled too tight over brittle bones, the veins beneath pulsating like something trapped. But it was the face that froze me. Or rather, the lack of one. There were no eyes, no nose, just a mouth, stitched shut with black thread. The skin where its features should have been was smooth, too smooth, as if someone had erased its identity altogether. Lisa gasped, her hand tightening around my arm with a force I barely registered before she screamed. That sound was enough to snap me into motion. I grabbed her and ran, my grip bruising her wrist as I yanked her along. Mark was already ahead of us, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the cracked tiles as he bolted toward the exit. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears, but what chilled me to the bone was the silence behind us, no footsteps, no hurried movement, just the sound of fabric dragging across the floor. It wasn't running. It was gliding. That whispering, raspy and broken, still murmured in the dark, its voice curling through the stagnant air. Be mine, be mine, be mine. We reached the main lobby, shoving against the rusted double doors, the metal groaning in protest as they finally gave way. The second we crossed the threshold into the night, the sound stopped. The whispering. The scraping. Everything. The absence of noise was almost worse. The streetlights cast long, uneven shadows, and for a moment it felt as though the entire town was holding its breath. I turned to Mark, panting, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. What the hell was that? I asked, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, his cigarette trembling between his fingers, staring back at the hospital as if expecting something to follow us out. Lisa pressed against my side, her voice barely above a whisper. I told you something was in the walls. Mark finally swallowed hard and muttered, we need to leave. Now. None of us argued. We practically ran down the winding streets toward the Jerome Grand Hotel, our shadows stretching unnaturally under the dim amber glow of the old street lamps. My mind reeled, trying to process what we had seen, but there was no logical explanation. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't a ghost. Ghosts don't move like that. Ghosts don't chase people. When we burst through the hotel doors, the front desk clerk, a bored-looking teenager, barely looked up from his phone. It was like stepping into a different world, one where what had just happened wasn't real. The normalcy of it all made my stomach churn. Mark grabbed my arm before I could head upstairs, his grip tighter than before. Listen to me, he said, his voice low, barely more than a breath. That thing, it's not part of some stupid ghost story. It's real. And it doesn't stop. Lisa pulled me away before I could ask what he meant. I locked the door the second we got into our room, double-checking the deadbolt even though I knew a lock wouldn't stop something like that. Lisa collapsed onto the bed, hugging her knees, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the old radiator and our own ragged breathing. Then Lisa whispered, you saw the writing on the walls, didn't you? I nodded slowly. Bloody Valentine. Her eyes met mine, wide, unblinking. Ethan. I think it was waiting for us. I opened my mouth to tell her she was wrong, that it was just paranoia, just adrenaline messing with her head, but before I could speak, the phone rang. Not my cell. The old, dusty landline on the nightstand. The one we hadn't used since checking in. We both stared at it, neither of us moving. It kept ringing, the shrill sound cutting through the thick silence. Lisa shook her head. Don't answer it. But I did. Static filled the receiver, crackling and uneven, and then, through the distortion, a voice I knew too well. My own. Ethan, it whispered. Don't let it in. The line went dead. The line went dead, but I kept holding the phone to my ear as if expecting something else to come through. My own voice had spoken to me, distorted, distant, but unmistakably mine. Lisa grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold, pulling me back into the moment. Who was it? She asked, though I could tell by her expression that she already knew the answer wasn't going to make her feel any better. My throat felt dry. I wanted to tell her it was nothing, a prank call, a bad connection, but the words wouldn't come out. I put the receiver down, hands trembling slightly as I stepped away from the nightstand. "We're leaving," I muttered, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. Lisa didn't argue. She was already grabbing her bag, tossing her things inside with a kind of frantic energy, her breathing shallow. I yanked open the dresser drawers, stuffing clothes into my backpack without caring if I left anything behind. There was no way in hell we were spending another night in Jerome. Then, just as I reached for my phone, the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the room, the hum of the old radiator dying at the same time. Lisa gasped, and I heard her stumble in the dark, her hands groping blindly for me. I reached out and pulled her close, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay near me," I whispered. The silence was worse than the dark. It pressed in around us, thick and suffocating, and then, somewhere in the hallway, footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The floorboards groaned under their weight, but there was something wrong with the rhythm. The steps weren't even. They dragged slightly, uneven and hesitant, as if whatever was outside the door wasn't entirely sure how to move like a person. Lisa tensed in my arms. "Ethan," she breathed, barely audible. I tightened my grip on her, my pulse roaring in my ears. We stood frozen, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. The silence stretched on, unbearable. My eyes had started adjusting to the dark, faint shapes forming in the shadows, but I didn't dare move. Then, the doorknob turned. Not a jolt. Not a sudden force. A slow, deliberate turn, the metal clicking softly as something tested the lock. My entire body locked up, every instinct screaming at me to do something, but what? There was no way out except through that door, and whatever was on the other side wasn't knocking to be let in. The knob twisted harder. Then, the whispering returned. "Be mine, be mine, be mine." The words were slow, painfully drawn out, each one crackling like a broken cassette tape. It wasn't human. It wasn't even trying to sound human anymore. Lisa was shaking. My mind raced. If we stayed still, would it leave? Or was it waiting for something? The phone call. My own voice had warned me, "Don't let it in." I reached for my bag. If we were getting out, we needed to move now. But the second I took a step, the door rattled violently, shaking in its frame as if something had slammed into it. Lisa screamed, and I shoved her back toward the bathroom. The door handle twisted wildly now, jerking back and forth with frantic urgency. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence returned, thick and absolute. The air felt charged, like a room right before a lightning strike. I couldn't tell if the thing had left or if it was just waiting. Lisa clutched my wrist. "We have to go," she whispered. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. Moving slowly, I reached for my phone, clicking on the flashlight. The dim glow barely illuminated the room, but it was enough to find our bags. We had one shot. I took a deep breath, reached for the door lock, and turned it as quietly as I could. The second it clicked, something slammed into the door, full force. Lisa shrieked, stumbling backward as the wood splintered inward. My breath caught in my throat. We had no time. I grabbed Lisa's hand and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. No sign of movement. No whispering. No stitch-mouth thing waiting for us. Just an endless stretch of darkened doors leading to other rooms and the faint glow of the exit sign at the end of the hall. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Lisa was right behind me, her breath ragged as we sprinted toward the stairwell. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it, feel the air shifting behind us, like something moving too fast to be seen. The whispering was back, louder now, more frantic, an echo that filled every inch of the hall. We hit the stairs hard, nearly tumbling over each other as we bolted downward. The old wooden steps creaked and groaned, and for a horrifying moment, I thought they would give out beneath us. But we kept going, my mind locked onto one singular thought: get out. Get out. Get out. When we burst into the hotel lobby, I expected to see someone, anyone. But the desk was empty. The lobby was dark. Even the kid at the front desk was gone, his chair spinning slowly as if he had just left. Lisa didn't stop. She grabbed my arm and practically dragged me toward the front doors. The streetlights outside glowed weakly, barely pushing back the heavy night. As soon as we were outside, I fumbled for my keys. Our car was parked just across the street, only a few yards away. It felt like miles. I dug into my pocket, my fingers shaking violently as I clicked the unlock button. The car beeped. I grabbed Lisa's hand, ready to run for it. Then we heard it. A whisper. Not behind us. Not in the hotel. Inside the car. I turned, the street lamp's glow reflecting off the windshield. And there, in the driver's seat, something was waiting. Lisa saw it too. She let out a strangled cry, yanking me backward. My stomach dropped. The thing's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging us. It wasn't stitched shut anymore. The black threads had ripped open, leaving a gaping, unnatural grin. And then it spoke. Happy Valentine's Day. The thing in the car grinned. Not a human grin, not an expression of joy or malice, but something stretched too far, too wide, its mouth gaping open where the black stitches had once been. The skin around its lips was torn, like it had forced its mouth apart for the first time in years. Happy Valentine's Day, it crooned, the words thick, wrong, as if spoken through a throat clogged with something wet. Lisa yanked me backward before I could even think. My fingers were still clenched around the car keys, but there was no way in hell we were getting into that vehicle. The street was empty, nothing but the flickering glow of the old street lamps casting warped shadows along the cracked pavement. No people. No cars. No way out. Then, with an unnatural slowness, the thing in the driver's seat turned its head toward us, its neck cracking as if the movement was unfamiliar, as if it hadn't been used in years. My breath came in short, panic gasps, my brain scrambling for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The doors to the hotel were still ajar, but I wasn't about to go back in there. Not after what had just happened. Lisa grabbed my wrist so hard I could feel her nails digging into my skin. Ethan, she breathed, voice trembling. It's coming. The thing in the car moved. Not fast. Slow. Deliberate. Its body shifted as it reached for the handle, fingers long and unnatural against the glass. The door clicked open with a soft creak, the sound somehow worse than if it had slammed. My chest tightened. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then it stepped out. The hospital gown hung loosely from its skeletal frame, dragging along the pavement as it floated forward. The whispering began again, soft, gentle, pleading. Be mine, be mine, be mine. Lisa and I bolted. We ran past the hotel, down the sloped street toward the main square, our breath ragged and uneven, our feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The town wasn't right. The buildings, usually filled with late-night tourists, were dark, abandoned, silent. There were no flickering bar signs, no music drifting from open doors. It was like we had stepped into a dead town, like Jerome had emptied itself just for us. We rounded the corner toward the main road, the only way out of town, but as we did, Lisa let out a strangled cry and skidded to a stop. My momentum nearly slammed me into her. The road was gone. Not blocked. Not covered in fog. Gone. Where the winding highway leading down the mountain should have been, there was only blackness. Not darkness, not an absence of streetlights, but an endless, yawning void stretching down the mountainside. My stomach lurched as I stared into it. There was nothing there. No trees, no rocks, no distant glow of Prescott City lights in the valley below. Just emptiness. Lisa backed away, gripping my arm like she thought I might fall forward. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, 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 this isn't real. But it was. Behind us, the whispering grew louder. I turned. The thing was still coming. Slowly, patiently, like it had all the time in the world. Its mouth hung open now, wider than any human jaw should allow, dark threads dangling from its torn lips like severed veins. And then, For the first time, I realized something. It had no eyes. No sockets, no hollow indentations where they should have been. Just smooth, unbroken skin. But somehow, I knew it could see us. It had been watching us all along. Lisa yanked at my arm, and we stumbled backward, away from the missing road, back toward the town center. We needed to hide, needed to find something real. Then the church bell rang. The sound split the air, deafening in the silence. A single, echoing chime that reverberated through the empty streets. My head snapped toward the source, the old church at the top of the hill, its steeple dark against the night sky. Lisa and I locked eyes. It was the only place left. Without speaking, we ran. The climb up the hill felt endless, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, but the whispering behind us never sped up. It didn't need to. It was waiting. By the time we reached the doors of the church, my hands were slick with sweat. I grabbed the handle, yanking, expecting it to be locked, but it opened. We stumbled inside, slamming the heavy doors shut behind us. The church was cold. Not in a natural way. Not like an unheated building in the middle of winter. This was wrong. A deep, unnatural chill that seemed to cling to the air, pressing into my skin. Lisa leaned against the door, panting, her fingers still clenched around my wrist. Her pulse hammered beneath her skin, her face pale, eyes wild. Then she whispered, "Ethan, look." I turned. The pews were full. Rows and rows of figures sat in the darkness, facing the pulpit, perfectly still. Their heads were bowed. Their hands rested gently on their laps. They did not move. They were all wearing hospital gowns. My stomach dropped. I tried to tell myself they were mannequins, props for some old ghost tour, but the air was too thick, too charged. Something was wrong. And then, in perfect unison, they began to hum. Low at first, barely above a whisper, a sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But it grew. A deep, vibrating hum that crawled beneath my skin, filling the air, surrounding us from all sides. Lisa clutched my arm. "We have to." The doors behind us rattled. Not a knock. Not a gentle push. Something slammed against them, shaking the old wooden frame. Lisa's breath hitched. The figures in the pews began to move. Slowly, unnaturally, their heads lifting, necks cracking. And then, one by one, they turned to look at us. The figures in the pews turned toward us, their movements slow, unnatural, deliberate, as if their bodies had forgotten how to function. The air grew thick, the low humming rising in volume, reverberating against the church's old wooden walls. I could feel it in my bones, a vibration, something crawling beneath my skin. Lisa's fingernails dug into my arm, her breath ragged. The doors behind us shook again, harder this time. Whatever was outside, whatever had followed us from the hotel, wanted in. But I wasn't sure what was worse, what was trying to break through the doors, or what was already inside. One of the figures shifted forward, its head rolling loosely to one side as if its neck was broken. Its hospital gown hung from its skeletal frame, and as it stood, I saw its feet weren't touching the floor. It was floating. And then it smiled. The stitches on its lips had burst open, its mouth stretching too wide, the skin at the edges splitting like something forcing its way out. And then it spoke. "Be mine, be mine, be mine." The voice was wrong, a chorus of overlapping whispers, male and female, young and old, echoing from deep within its chest. Lisa screamed. The doors shook violently, the wood splintering, and I knew we had seconds before whatever was outside came crashing in. I grabbed Lisa's arm, pulling her down the aisle, past the unmoving rows of figures still watching us, their empty, stitched mouths twitching, their fingers flexing as if testing their joints. I had no plan. No idea where to go. We ran toward the altar, my brain working frantically to find a way out, but there were no doors, no windows large enough to escape through. Just stained glass depictions of St. Valentine, his serene face looking down on us, bathed in the glow of flickering candlelight. Behind us, the pews creaked. The figures were standing now, all of them. Lisa let out a strangled sob. "There's nowhere to go," she gasped, backing against the altar. I could see her hands shaking, her chest rising and falling too fast. Then, a thought hit me. The bell. The church bell had rung right before we got here. Someone, or something, had rung it. Maybe there was a way up. I grabbed Lisa's hand and yanked her toward a side door, praying it wasn't locked. My fingers wrapped around the handle, and with a desperate shove, it gave way. A staircase spiraled upward into darkness. We ran. The air grew colder as we climbed, each step groaning beneath our weight. Lisa's breathing was ragged, but she didn't stop. I didn't stop. The whispering below was rising, joining the humming, an unnatural symphony of voices that didn't belong together. Halfway up, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The figures were following us. Not running. Not climbing. Floating. Their feet never touched the ground, their limbs hanging limply as they drifted up the spiral staircase without moving their legs. Lisa saw them too. She let out a choked gasp, her grip tightening in mine. "Faster," she begged. We reached the top. A small wooden door stood before us, ancient and rotting, its iron latch rusted. I threw my shoulder into it, the wood groaning, bending, but not breaking. Below us, the whispering grew louder. Lisa pounded against the door with her fists, sobbing. "Ethan, hurry, hurry, please, please." I threw myself against it again, harder this time, and with a deafening crack, the wood splintered inward. We stumbled into the bell tower. The air was sharp and frigid, the open archways revealing the vast emptiness of the night. The massive bronze bell loomed over us, the rope swaying gently in the breeze. Lisa collapsed against the cold stone, gasping for breath. I turned, slamming the broken door shut behind us, searching for something, anything, to barricade it. Too late. The whispering was right outside. A long, pale hand slid through the broken wood, thin fingers curling around the frame, pulling. I backed away. The wood snapped. A figure slid through the gap, its body pouring inside like smoke through a broken window. It stood slowly, rising to its full height, its stitched mouth splitting open. Lisa grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the ledge. The town stretched below us, endless blackness where the road should have been. The void that had swallowed the highway was spreading. I turned back. The figure was closer now, its face smooth, empty, no eyes, but I could feel it looking at us. It raised one long, bony hand. It reached for me. Lisa screamed my name. I had nowhere left to run. So I did the only thing I could. I grabbed the bell rope and pulled. The bell rang out, shattering the silence, the sound so loud and piercing it rattled through my skull. The air shook. The whispering stopped. The figure twitched. The humming below cut off abruptly, the entire church falling deathly silent. And then, the figure screamed. Not a human scream. Not even close. It was a sound that bent the air, that made my vision blur, that split open the night like thunder. The figures below let out inhuman shrieks, their bodies jerking violently, spasming as if the sound of the bell was ripping them apart. Lisa covered her ears, sobbing. "Ethan, pull it again." I yanked the rope, my muscles straining, the bell booming through the night. The figures convulsed, their bodies warping, unraveling, dissolving into threads of darkness. The thing in front of us reached for me one last time. Then, it was gone. The whispering stopped. The humming stopped. The world went silent. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Lisa collapsed against me, shaking violently, her hands still over her ears. I could feel my own heartbeat slamming against my ribs, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gulps. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, until finally, the town below was back. The lights in the streets flickered on, the highway winding down the mountain exactly where it should have been. The void was gone. The world had returned. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "Is it over?" I didn't know. I wanted to believe it. But then, far below, from somewhere deep beneath the town, I heard the whisper. Be mine, be mine, be mine. For a moment, I thought the whispering was in my head. It was faint, rising from the depths of the town, slipping through the cracks in the earth, a sound that didn't belong in the world we had returned to. Lisa clung to me, her breath still coming in ragged gasps, her nails digging into my wrist as if she needed something solid to anchor herself. The town below looked normal again, the winding road was back, the streetlights flickered in the dim glow of early morning, and the buildings sat where they had always been. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The whispering was still there. Faint. Waiting. Lisa must have heard it too, because she slowly pulled away from me, her expression twisted in exhausted terror. We have to get out of here, she murmured. Before it comes back. I didn't argue. We moved carefully down the staircase, each step creaking under our weight, the wooden beams groaning as if the church itself had been damaged by what had just happened. When we reached the ground floor, I hesitated, peering through the doorway back into the main chapel. The pews were empty. The figures in hospital gowns were gone, the flickering candles casting long shadows over the abandoned room. There was no sign they had ever been there at all. Lisa squeezed my hand. Let's go. We pushed through the heavy doors and stepped into the cold morning air. Jerome was eerily quiet. The buildings looked the same, but there was a strange emptiness to the town, as if something had swept through and stolen the very essence of life. No tourists. No early risers. Just empty streets and the hum of the wind curling through alleyways. We walked fast, my fingers gripping the car keys so tightly my knuckles ached. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, but there was nothing. Just our own hurried breathing and the quiet crunch of gravel underfoot. The car was exactly where we left it. The driver's door was open. For a brief second, I stopped walking, every hair on my body standing on end. The thing that had been inside, it was gone. But where? Lisa noticed too. Ethan, don't. Just get in, she pleaded, her voice shaking. I hesitated, then slowly stepped toward the open door, my breath catching as I leaned inside. The interior was empty. The seat looked untouched, the dashboard clean. There were no signs that anything had ever been there. And yet, I knew. It was still somewhere in this town. I climbed in, shoved the key into the ignition, and turned it. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Lisa was already in the passenger seat, her hands gripping the dashboard like she expected something to come slamming into the car at any second. I threw it into reverse, backing out fast, gravel kicking up behind the tires as I spun onto the main road. The streetlights flickered. And then, for just a second, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure. Standing in the middle of the road, directly behind us, watching. It wasn't moving. It wasn't chasing. It was just waiting. I didn't tell Lisa. I just drove. The town faded behind us, the winding road leading us down the mountain, away from Jerome, away from whatever had almost claimed us that night. The radio hissed with static as we descended, a soft white noise filling the silence, and I didn't dare touch the dial. Lisa didn't speak. She just stared out the window, fingers pressed to her lips, her expression unreadable. By the time we reached Prescott, the sun had fully risen, casting long golden light across the landscape, the normal world finally creeping back in. I pulled into a gas station, my hands still gripping the wheel too tightly, my pulse still too fast. Lisa turned to me, her voice raw. Do we tell someone? I thought about that for a long time. I thought about Mark, the historian who had led us into that hell, about the empty hotel, the town that had felt like a ghost of itself, as if reality had bent in a way it wasn't supposed to. I thought about the whispering. Be mine, be mine, be mine. Finally, I shook my head. No one would believe us. Lisa didn't argue. We left Arizona that same afternoon. We drove straight through to California, neither of us sleeping, neither of us stopping for longer than a few minutes. The further we got from Jerome, the lighter the air felt, the weight of something unnatural finally lifting off our shoulders. By the time we got home, it was like it had never happened. Except it had. We never talked about it again. Lisa refused to even say the name of the town after that night, and I didn't push. We both wanted to forget. We both needed to believe that we had escaped. And for a while, it worked. For a whole year, nothing happened. No whispers. No figures standing at the foot of our bed. No stitch-mouthed things crawling out of the dark. We moved on. We lived. But then, this morning, Valentine's Day, I woke up to find an envelope on our kitchen table. A red envelope, wax-sealed, no return address. My blood ran cold. Lisa was still asleep, unaware, so I hesitated before picking it up. My fingers trembled as I peeled the wax away and slid the card out. It was a Valentine's Day card. Old-fashioned, faded, like something you'd find in an antique shop. I turned it over. A single sentence was scrawled inside, written in red ink. "You never really left." My hands began to shake. And then, from the other room, I heard Lisa's voice, soft, broken, wrong, whispering. "Be mine, be mine, be mine." I froze, the card trembling in my hands, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. Lisa was still in bed. I knew she was. I had just seen her, tangled in the sheets, her breathing slow and steady. But the voice from the other room, whispering those words in that fractured, unnatural tone, it wasn't hers. The air in the house thickened, pressing on my chest like unseen hands squeezing my ribs, making it hard to breathe. Above me, the kitchen light flickered once, casting strange, uneven shadows across the countertops, distorting the familiar space into something unrecognizable. I turned my head slowly, heart hammering against my ribs, and took a single step toward the bedroom. The whispering didn't stop. "Be mine, be mine, be mine." The bedroom door was slightly open, just a crack, enough for me to see the soft glow of early morning light spilling onto the sheets. Lisa lay on her side, her back facing me, completely still, too still. The voice was coming from the other side of the bed. There was something else in the room. A shadow stretched along the far wall, distorted by the angle of the sunlight filtering through the blinds. It was tall, its head tilted unnaturally, as if listening, watching. My body locked up, every nerve screaming at me to turn and run, but I didn't move, didn't even breathe. Lisa let out a soft sigh, shifting slightly in her sleep, but the shadow remained motionless, clinging to the farthest corner of the room like something waiting to be noticed. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate motion, the shadow turned its head toward me. There was nothing there, no eyes, no face, just an empty void where features should have been. But I felt it staring, felt the weight of its attention sinking into my skin like ice-cold needles. A deep, sinking cold filled my gut. I needed to wake Lisa up, now. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm, shaking her hard. "Lisa, wake up, wake up." My voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Her eyes snapped open, wide with pure terror, pupils dilated so much that her irises looked black. She parted her lips as if to scream, but no sound came out, her breath hitching in her throat, her body frozen in shock. Then she gasped, inhaling sharp and sudden like someone breaking through the surface of deep water, finally able to breathe after being trapped beneath the weight of something unspeakable. The shadow in the corner lurched backward, vanishing into the wall like smoke being sucked into the air. Lisa shot up fast, pressing her hands to her face, her entire body trembling violently as though she had been holding herself still for too long and had finally snapped free of whatever force had pinned her down. Her voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "It was here." I nodded. "I know." We sat there, staring at each other, caught in the aftermath of something we couldn't explain. Lisa ran a shaky hand through her hair, her breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. Her gaze darted toward the spot where the shadow had been as if she expected it to reappear, as if it had only retreated for a moment. Slowly, her attention shifted, and her expression changed, her face draining of color. She was looking at the card still clutched in my fingers. She reached for it, hesitating as if touching it might hurt her, her fingers brushing against the wax seal, her breath quickening. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How did this get here?" I swallowed hard, my own voice unsteady. It was on the kitchen table when I woke up. No name. No address. Lisa turned the card over, reading the message again and again as if trying to make sense of it, trying to convince herself it was something else. You never really left. She shook her head, her hands trembling, her lips parting slightly as she tried to force out words that wouldn't come. I don't understand, she finally managed. We got out. We made it home. Lisa. My voice was barely audible, my stomach twisting in on itself. I pointed at the card, my skin suddenly ice cold. Your hands. They're smudging the ink. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. The words weren't written in ink. They were wet. A fresh, deep red, the strokes glistening in the morning light. My throat clenched as I watched a single drop slide down the edge of the card, streaking across Lisa's fingertips, staining her pale skin. It was blood. Lisa let out a strangled gasp, dropping the card as if it had burned her. She scrambled backward against the headboard, her hands trembling, her breathing ragged and uneven. No, 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 her voice cracked with raw panic. The floor creaked. The bedroom light dimmed, flickering weakly, the warm glow of morning failing to push back the shadows creeping into the corners of the room. We both turned toward the doorway, our breath caught in our throats. And then we heard it. From the hallway. A voice, soft, broken, whispering. Be mine, be mine, be mine. Something was in the house with us. Lisa grabbed my wrist, her grip like iron, her nails digging into my skin. We have to go, she whispered, her voice shaking. Now. I didn't hesitate. Snatching my keys from the nightstand, I shoved my feet into my shoes as Lisa grabbed her jacket, her fingers fumbling as panic overtook her. The whispering grew louder, closer, as if whatever was outside the door was moving toward us, slipping between the shadows, slithering through the walls. I yanked the bedroom door open. Nothing was there, but the air felt wrong, thick and heavy, suffocating in a way that had nothing to do with the house itself. The hallway stretched before us, too dark for the time of day, the light failing to touch the walls as if the shadows were absorbing it. Lisa was already moving, practically dragging me down the hall, through the living room, toward the front door. But the moment we reached it, the locks clicked shut. By themselves. The sound was final. Every deadbolt twisted into place, sealing us inside. Lisa let out a horrified sob, yanking at the handle with both hands, but it wouldn't budge. I spun around, my eyes darting to the windows. Without thinking, I grabbed the closest lamp and hurled it at the glass. It bounced off. Didn't even crack. Lisa let out a choked, panicked cry, pounding her fists against the door, her voice high and desperate. Ethan, we have to get out. My breath hitched as I turned back toward the hallway. And it was standing there. Tall, motionless, its head tilted slightly to the side, the black stitches along its mouth still torn apart, its lips curled into something almost human, almost smiling. It raised one bony, too long hand and pressed a single finger to its lips. Shoo! Lisa's knees buckled as she collapsed to the floor, her breath leaving her in a strangled gasp. The lights flickered violently, the whispering swelling, filling the house, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. And then, before the world went dark, I heard the last thing it said. Happy Valentine's Day. The whispering swallowed me whole, a suffocating force that wrapped around my skin, pressing into my ears, seeping into my lungs as the world around me vanished into darkness. My vision blurred, the house collapsing into a void of endless noise and static. Lisa's breath hitched in terror, her nails digging into my arm as she clung to me, but I could barely feel her. I could barely feel anything. A deep, sickening cold coiled around my spine, numbing my limbs, pulling me downward, and then, just as suddenly as it came, it stopped. Silence. My eyes snapped open. I was somewhere else. The house was gone. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, all of it had disappeared, leaving behind an endless, empty white room stretching into the horizon, its edges undefined, dissolving into nothing. The air was thick, almost heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had been solidified, pressing in on my chest, making it difficult to move. I turned my head slowly, my breath shallow. Lisa was next to me, her fingers still clenched around my wrist, her body tense. Her eyes darted around the endless white, lips parted in disbelief, in terror. "Where are we?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. A sound broke the silence, a heartbeat. Slow. Rhythmic. I turned sharply, my muscles locking as I searched for the source. It wasn't coming from me, and it wasn't coming from Lisa. It was everywhere, pulsing through the air, vibrating through my skull like something buried beneath my skin. Deep. Hollow. Wrong. Then, footsteps. Slow. Dragging. Coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Lisa's grip tightened around my arm as she whispered, "Ethan, we have to move." We ran. I don't know why. There was no direction, no landmarks, just the same empty space stretching endlessly, but something told me we had to go, had to get away from whatever was coming. Our footsteps didn't echo. They made no sound at all, swallowed by the thick, pulsing air, like the space itself was devouring any sign that we had ever existed. The footsteps behind us grew louder. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see. Lisa's breath was sharp and uneven, her fear feeding into mine as we ran through the nothingness, hoping, praying, that there was an end to this place, that there was a way out. Then I saw it. A door. It stood alone in the white expanse, tall and old, its wooden frame warped, its handle tarnished with something dark, something red. Lisa saw it too. We didn't stop. We reached for the handle at the same time, our fingers colliding, grasping, turning. The door swung open. And suddenly, we were falling. The whiteness shattered, dissolving around us as we plummeted into the dark, weightless, breathless, lost in a void that stretched in all directions. Lisa's scream was swallowed before it could even leave her lips, the emptiness ripping the sound away as we dropped through eternity. Then, impact. The world slammed back into existence. I was on solid ground again, gasping, my chest heaving as I fought to breathe. My fingers dug into the dirt beneath me, cold, damp, real. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of rot and something metallic. Lisa was next to me, trembling, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her body together. She looked at me, her face pale, her lips barely moving. "Ethan, we're back." I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. She was right. We were in Jerome. Not just Jerome. The hospital. The United Verde Hospital, where it had all begun. But something was different. The walls were no longer crumbling, no longer covered in graffiti and decay. They were intact, clean, the peeling paint replaced with stark white, the air thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic. The lights flickered dimly overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floors. It was new. Like we had stepped back into the past. Lisa took a shaky step forward, her voice barely above a breath. "Ethan, I don't think this is real." I knew she was right. A voice echoed from down the hall. A familiar voice. "Be mine, be mine, be mine." Lisa flinched, her hand darting out to grab mine, her nails pressing into my skin. "It's here," she whispered, and I knew she was right. It had never let us go. The whispering grew louder, the sound curling through the hallways, moving toward us, filling the air with something thick and unbearable. The light above us flickered violently, casting the world into brief flashes of dark and light, and in between those pulses, I saw it. It stood at the end of the hallway, tall and waiting, its stitched mouth hanging open, torn and bleeding, its head tilted, its skin stretched too tight over something that wasn't human. It had followed us home. Lisa squeezed my hand, her breath coming in sharp, shuddering gasps. "Ethan," she whimpered, her fingers trembling against mine. "What do we do?" The thing took a step forward. The air grew thick, pressing against my ribs, filling my throat with something heavy and choking. The door behind us slammed shut. The lights flickered again, slower this time, each pause in the dark lasting a little longer. The whispering grew deafening. I knew what was coming. Lisa's grip on me tightened, her body tense, her breath fast and shallow. I could feel her pulse hammering through her fingers, frantic, terrified. The thing at the end of the hall didn't move, but I knew it was waiting for something, knew it was watching, knew it was enjoying this moment. Then, the lights went out completely. The whispering stopped. The air was thick and suffocating, wrapping around my lungs, squeezing my ribs. Lisa's breath hitched in panic, and in that moment of absolute silence, I felt something cold press against my skin. Not a hand. Lips. A voice whispered directly into my ear. "Happy Valentine's Day." The whisper crawled into my skull, thick and wet, curling around my thoughts like rotting fingers pressing into my brain. My breath hitched, my muscles locking up as something cold and unseen traced along my jaw. Lisa let out a strangled gasp, her grip on my hand tightening to the point of pain. Then, the lights exploded back on. I staggered backward, gasping, my vision swimming as the world around us solidified once more. The hallway stretched endless before us, flickering fluorescents buzzing overhead. The hospital was alive now, not the crumbling ruin we had explored a year ago, but something pristine, untouched, frozen in time. The walls gleamed with a sterility that should have been comforting but wasn't. The air smelled of antiseptic and something sickly sweet, like old flowers left in a vase too long. And at the end of the corridor, waiting, was it. The thing with the torn mouth, the thing that had whispered to us from the dark corners of our home, the thing that had never truly let us go. Its stitched lips bled openly now, dark rivulets streaking its chin as it stood completely still, waiting. It didn't move, didn't breathe, yet I could feel it pulling us closer. Lisa's nails bit into my arm, but she didn't make a sound. We both knew now, this was the end. We had spent a year pretending, thinking we had escaped, trying to push the memories deep down where they couldn't reach us. But it had been watching. Waiting. We had never left. A sound crackled to life overhead, an intercom system clicking on, static hissing in the silence. A voice, low, crooning, soaked in something awful, spilled from the speakers. Room 214. It's time. The thing at the end of the hall tilted its head, its torn lips curling into something grotesque. Then, it raised a hand and pointed toward the door on our left. Room 214. I shook my head. No, we weren't going in there. Lisa's breathing came fast and ragged, her body trembling against mine. "Ethan," she whispered, voice cracking, "if we don't go in, it'll take us anyway." She was right. I could feel it, the pressure of unseen hands creeping toward us, the weight of something inescapable pressing against my chest. I reached for the door handle. The second I touched it, the air collapsed inward, and we were pulled inside. The room was cold, the air heavy with the scent of metal and something far worse. The walls were lined with beds, hospital beds, rusted, stained, occupied. Shapes lay beneath the sheets, motionless, their bodies covered except for their faces. Faces with stitched mouths. I couldn't breathe. My pulse thundered in my skull, my knees nearly buckling beneath me. The figures weren't dead. Their chests rose and fell slowly, their fingers twitching beneath the covers, as if they were in some kind of sleep, some kind of waiting. Lisa let out a choked sob. At the far end of the room stood a single, empty bed. Its sheets were pristine, the pillow perfectly aligned. Beside it, a small silver tray of surgical tools gleamed under the buzzing fluorescent lights. And at the foot of the bed, a red envelope. Lisa shook her head violently, stepping back, pulling me with her. No, I won't do this." Her voice was cracking, her panic spilling over, but I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't work, my lungs refused to take in enough air. I could only stare. The thing had followed us inside. It stood by the doorway, blocking our only way out. Watching. Waiting. Lisa reached for me, desperation in her eyes, but it moved then, too fast, too sudden, a blur of pale limbs in a hospital gown, and it was behind her. Its hands gripped her shoulders. Lisa screamed. I lunged forward, but my body collapsed inward, the air sucked from my lungs as if something had reached inside my ribs and squeezed. My vision warped, my head spinning as the fluorescent lights flickered wildly overhead. Lisa was sobbing, fighting, struggling, but she wasn't moving. The thing was whispering into her ear, its voice thick, sickeningly sweet, dripping with something ancient and unnatural. I could see her legs trembling, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to move, wanted to run, but couldn't. And then, her mouth began to open. The stitches weren't there before. But they were now. Dark, thick black thread piercing her lips, sewing them shut, pulling tighter and tighter as her eyes rolled back, her body convulsing. I screamed her name. The thing turned its head toward me, its mouth opening, stretched, gaping, wide enough to tear. Then everything collapsed. The lights burst, sending shards of glass raining down, the room tilting, spinning, tearing itself apart. The walls peeled back like rotting skin, the ceiling crumbling, and I was falling again, dragged into the dark, screaming her name over and over and over. Then, silence. I woke up alone. I was in my bed. The sheets were tangled, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The room was normal. No hospital, no flickering lights, no whispering voices. Just me. But Lisa was gone. I sat up too fast, my head pounding, my chest heaving. I called her name, but the house was silent. No response. No movement. Then I saw it. On the kitchen table. A red envelope. My fingers shook as I reached for it, tearing open the seal, my pulse hammering so loudly I could barely think. Inside was a single photograph. It was Lisa, lying in a hospital bed. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, her mouth stitched shut. A message was scrawled beneath the image, written in dark, wet ink. Be mine. I let out a strangled gasp, my vision blurring, my pulse thundering in my ears. My hands trembled as I turned the photo over, my breath catching in my throat as I read the final message written on the back. Room 214 is waiting. The whisper curled against my ear, soft and familiar. Happy Valentine's Day.